Thank you for the introduction. As you said, I do work in adult developmental disabilities. My main focus with the dual diagnosis team is in looking at the sensory aspect, because that's an area that as an OT I can bring that lens to the team that perhaps isn't always in the forefront. And that's what I would like people to go away with today. Just thinking about from your own perspective, if you leave here thinking of one thing that is important to you from a sensory perspective in what you do and how you organize your day, and then realize the impact that has if you couldn't do those things, and then what it might mean for the clients that we work with. Before I get started, can I just get a show of hands as to sort of who I have in the audience? Physicians, psychologists, psychiatrists, speech, one, speaking next, I guess. Who am I missing? Give me some, sorry? Allied health?
Behavior therapy.
Behavior therapy?
Nurses.
Nurses? Go, good point, okay.
Educators.
Educators, excellent. Anyone we're missing?
There's a group of us here from Autism, Ontario.
Oh, excellent. That's lovely too. Okay. Good. Well, welcome to all. That's the best thing, is to have a range of people. I always start with this picture. What do you get? You look at this picture. Just Iceland. Cold. What other impressions? Now, there's always one person in the room. Cool. Some people say calm. Some people say forbidding. It evokes a different feeling for different people. So, skiing. You're at the top of a double black diamond, Sunshine, Alberta. There's about a 1,000 vertical slope averaging between 45 degrees, sometimes up to 50. That's me with a smile on my face. How many people have a smile on their face? There's always one or two. How many people are experiencing different emotions now? You have to get down this. What kind of emotions?
Fear.
Fear. What does fear do to you? Where do you feel it in your body? Tension. Paralyzing. In your gut, maybe. Again, just a picture, but it can bring very different responses to people. I don't have a picture of me in it, but that's what it looks like from the inside. On a really good powder day. Unfortunately, I haven't had a really good one like that, but it's an awesome ski run if you want to try it. Anyways, your world is what your senses tell you it is, right? It's the limitations of your senses that set the boundaries. If you look or experience something and it feels frightening to you, it doesn't matter that somebody else says, oh, no, it's okay, relax, it's fine. If it invokes a fear response in you, there's nothing that somebody else is going to say when you're in the middle of it that is really going to help at that time. We all have individual nervous systems. They work for us in different ways. There's certainly a continuum, but it's very important to keep that in mind. I'm going to start, typically when I do these presentations, I do a lot of kind of hands-on. I wasn't sure what was going to be, the setup was going to be, so I'm going to rely on little video clips instead. So we're going to, the first one, if anybody's interested, I'm not going to do this now. It's about 7 minutes. It's a great little thing narrated by a little child about what sensory processing means to me. He's on the autism spectrum. It's a really handy tool, educating parents, etc. I'm going to use this one where we let Sheldon tell us a little bit about sensory overload.
What are you doing?
I'm trying to raise the temperature in here before my nipples tear through my shirt.
Why don't you just turn up the thermostat?
Aha, good question. It turns out that the thermostat for my new office isn't in my new office. No, it's next door in Professor Davenport's office, who is currently enjoying the hot flashes associated with menopause.
Why is there a hole here?
Why is there a hole in my new office? I've narrowed it down to two possibilities. There was something in the wall that someone outside the wall wanted, or, the more disturbing, there was something in the wall that wanted out.
At least you finally got a window that opens. That's nice.
Is it? Listen.
What, you don't like wind chimes?
No, I hate them, but it gets worse. There it is.
Bird?
Yeah, it's completely out of tune with the wind chimes.
So?
You don't get it, do you? That's a mockingbird. Mockingbirds can change their song, which means he's out of tune on purpose. He's mocking me.
That's the part, well, the whole thing is entertaining, but that's the part I wanted. He's assigning blame externally to the mockingbird. You're doing this on purpose to me. For somebody who has an overreactive nervous system, that's what it can feel like. Working in the schools, you'd frequently have, hear about the kids who just, they can't sit still in their seat, they're all over the place. They're the kids who are in line and somebody comes up behind them and they're just standing in line with them and they, hey, you hit me, and they lash out and hit the kid. And then they end up down at the office, and maybe this has been the third time this week, and they go home suspended because they have a hyperactive tactile system. Doesn't seem very fair. But when you're in that kind of heightened reaction, you're not thinking, oh, we don't hit our friends, we talk nicely, we work it out. So I'm going to go briefly through the sensory systems. I'm pretty sure everybody here is aware of them and the basics. You can always go Google them or look them up in your neurotext if you need more details. So I'm going to try to sort of push through this fairly quickly. But before I even go further, how many sensory systems do we have?
5.
I got 5 and I got 7. 7's win. In fact, 8 if you want to include interoception, that sense of what's going on inside your body. The 5 are the ones we know about, right? The touch, taste, smell, sound, and vision. The other are your auditory, your proprioception and your vestibular, and those are the ones that are big for OTs in terms of looking at. So I'm just going to go through the systems briefly. So with the tactile system, of course, your receptors are all over your body, senses light touch, deep touch. There's receptors even in the hair cells, so you move your hair follicles. Anybody who's had long hair in a ponytail and puts it up in a ponytail all day, you take it down at the end of the day, nobody's going to tell me that your hair cells don't have tactile or pain receptors. That can be really uncomfortable. I was just at a conference this weekend, 2 OTs, one about self-regulation, and she was working with a typical adult who had, an actress who had severe sensory things and just hadn't had it identified previously, but to the point she was desperately trying to get used to wearing socks because she couldn't stand how it moved her hair follicles. So she had just avoided them as much as possible throughout her life. It's got 2 functions, your protective function, the pain, temperature, that kind of thing, and the discriminative that allows you to pick up a pen and write on the paper, even with gloves on, be able to do some things with it, with your hands. It allows you to discriminate the difference in textures. Some people like cotton sheets, some people like slidey sheets, some people like certain types of fabrics. That's where the discriminative touch function comes in. Some of the challenges that can be related to tactile dysfunction, if they're over-responsive to touch, like Sheldon seems to be, among many other sensory systems. Think of the infant who has an overreactive tactile system. How do we interact with the infants? It's all touch. Well, it's not all touch, but it's a pretty significant part of it. How do we bond? A lot of that is through the touch. If you have an infant with a very hyper tactile system, they are going to often scream and cry when you pick them up, when you try to soothe them. That's going to have an effect on the attachment bond. I worked with a young woman on the high end of the autism spectrum, and she was 19, very, managing some university courses, so certainly doing well in some respects, but lots of drug use, lots of anxiety. She was referred to our dual diagnosis team. In doing the sort of the interviews through all the different disciplines, it came out that there certainly was a long history of what I would look at as sensory defensive things as an infant. She was very difficult to soothe. She needed, only settled in a car, couldn't be cuddled. She had a very distant relationship with her mother. Her mother was a neonatal nurse. And I can imagine that as an individual who works in the profession, that you would be very distressed if you could not bond or soothe your infant. And then what would happen is that detachment. So the tactile system is crucial, as all our nervous systems, parts of our sensory system. That tactile defensiveness can lead to increased cortisol levels, because if you're always in that agitated state, then you're constantly going to be flooded with the chemicals, and then it's difficult to bring yourself down again. That also has an effect on health down the road. If it's underreactive, you have poor discrimination, clumsy. Lots of kids that I worked with in the schools, difficulty, learning to print or write. Individuals that I work with in residential settings, often it's difficulty feeding themselves, managing utensils, managing the basics of day-to-day activity and function. It can be have difficulty maintaining the attention on the things you need to. Most people here today probably dressed in something that was fairly comfortable, knowing you're going to have to sit there and listen to somebody drone on up here. The room's kind of warm. You've just had a really nice lunch, so it's likely people are going to be going into a lower end of registration. But if you had tactile issues, and often I will start this, I hand out burlap scarves to everybody to put on, and that typically gets people aroused, not in a good way. But if you're spending a lot of your mental energy on the feeling of your pants or the tag on the back of your neck, it doesn't leave that much for focus and attention. I worked with a child in the school, he was in a grade 3 class. The teacher was fabulous. She was so on the ball. And she said, when I came for the first observation, oh, he's not going to be able to do much this week. He's breaking in a new pair of overalls. So he was wearing a pair of jean overalls, and to Mom, it was very important to make sure to keep expanding his ability to tolerate things within his comfort zone. But the teacher was all on board and knew that this was not going to be a week where he was going to manage new learning very well. If you're under-registering, you may seek out excessive amounts of tactile input. People who handle everything. Again, individuals in group homes, and some of our residential clients that I've worked with, or those who are on the lower end of the cognitive scale, seeking out excessive tactile input can be fine, but if it's not provided, if there aren't a lot of opportunities, there's lots of opportunities in the body. We have all sorts of orifices and secretions, and if you don't have the social concept that some of those things are not for public, that those are private, or that there may be health issues with fecal matter or ingestion or smearing, and if you're very sensory oriented and not bothered by things, well, it's there, it came from me. Should be okay. So it can cause a significant, that underreactivity can cause some issues if it's not sort of understood and addressed. Because things, particularly things like that, they set off alarm bells for people, and the big, behavior is a big word. But if that was the case, would that be able to be addressed by meeting some of those sensory needs, and would that decrease the need to look for it in their own way? The vestibular system, your sense of balance. It's in your inner ear. Anybody here had an inner ear infection, a vestibular challenge? It's pretty nasty, eh? Very difficult to function. I talk about this a lot. I get dizzy easily. I can, I'm not very good on planes and trains. I'm great when I got skis on my feet, though. I'll explain that part later. I had a vestibular issue last fall, just out of the blue. I was in the middle of a yoga class. Luckily, my yoga teacher is also an osteopath. And I did one transition, and it was like somebody took the globe and spun it. And it was just like I'd had a liter of gin all of a sudden. It was so debilitating. I lay down, I couldn't move. She eventually helped me out of the class. As soon as I moved, I was nauseous. She was able to do some work as an osteopath on my neck, and felt that for me, what seemed to have kicked off was a little bit of atlantoaxial and instability and a little bit of movement. The next day, I was okay, but it certainly, I wasn't functional at all for that day. I had to get somebody to come and pick me up. I never get sick. My daughter was stunned. What do you mean Mom needs me to pick her up? So vestibular is very, very powerful. Anybody who does get nauseous, car sick, air sick, seasick, they know that feeling. We can choose whether or not to get on a boat or get on a plane, but if just simple movements cause that amount of reaction, again, it's a very strong input. It's also, your vestibular system is key to your posture, controlling your balance. It helps to have the muscles, along with your proprioceptive, keep you upright in the flexors and the extensors. And if it doesn't work, you'd think that somebody might be falling over. I saw a video, Dr. Norman Doidge, who, I can't remember the name of the book, The Brain That Changes Itself. And the first case study he does in there, a woman who her vestibular apparatus was killed by an antibiotic. And she hadn't really been informed that that was a possible side effect. And it showed a videotape of her trying to stand up. So she had vertigo all the time. And I'm thinking, okay, you'd be swaying. No, she was doing this weird wave thing. And of course, when I saw that, I realized because your vestibular system is responsible for working with your proprioceptive, with your muscles, for balancing the extension and the flexors of the body to keep you upright against gravity. It's closely connected to your auditory and your visual, obviously just by anatomy as well as by wiring, and it's important for helping to sort of put a lid on some other systems. Nobody teaches you, okay, when you have a baby, you're going to sit here and you're going to rock back and forth slowly, rhythmically from one foot to the next. It's rather instinctual, isn't it? So, as I said, oversensitive, somebody's very fearful of changes of position, reliant on vision. If every change is either telling you something different, you're going to really try to use your vision to focus. Dancers use that to help decrease the vestibular response when they spin. Difficulty with stairs, escalators. This is a red flag for me. If I have people, have come in and there's behavior issues and they're, as part of the team, I'll always be asking about, not with every behavior issue, but things, how do they manage stairs? How do they manage curbs, changing surfaces in the floor, going from grass to pavement? We had an individual who came in and again, she was, the staff said, oh, she's, it's just behavior. She just, she drops, she just flops, she's just looking for the attention. And in asking more questions, maybe there was an element of that, absolutely. You do learn what happens when you do something. But it turned out she had a visual perceptual issue. She would go up down the stairs on her hands and her knees or go down with both hands holding onto the railing. So we sent her to the University of Waterloo for a consult, and she ended up with prism lenses that shifted where the visual midline was, and she managed much better, and she wasn't having those out of the blue drops. When it's underreactive, They, people who actually either know individuals who will spin a lot of, or even typically developing kids on the playground who will go around on the tire swing, except they don't allow tire swings anymore. They don't allow much in playgrounds anymore. They can just keep doing it because they're just not triggering a response. If you need that much input, it can be difficult to maintain attention. Again, individuals that I've worked with in group homes on the lower end of the nonverbal, on the lower end of the cognitive scale, who were fairly strong sensory seekers, significant behaviors. They got this guide to Canada's Wonderland. They didn't have any problems at lunchtime. They didn't have any problems with him waiting in line, touching other people. He could go on ride after ride after ride. That's difficult to replicate in day-to-day life, to meet that need. So it takes some creativity. But when you see that, it makes you understand for some individuals what is needed to keep their nervous system sort of relaxed and organized and plugged in. Proprioceptive system is your body awareness in space, your muscles, joints. It allows us to interact with the world. It goes through cerebellum. It's processed with other input to make sense of touch and vestibular. Proprioceptive is a good one. You almost can't go wrong with giving either heavy muscle work, deep touch, resistive exercises, chewing gum, if the person can chew gum. But proprioceptive doesn't tend to be overloading to the nervous system like most of the other senses can be in excess amounts. So it's always a good default to go to. Can we get this individual doing something more active? Picking up the garbage to take it outside, carrying 2 loads of laundry to the washing machine as part of their day-to-day activity as opposed to 1. They're the ones who always take the wet laundry out of the dryer, and somebody else helps with, maybe setting the table, that kind of thing. So when your proprioceptive system isn't working, you have difficulties with motor planning, you can fatigue easily, grading movement. So again, some of the reports from either family or group home staff might be, well, they're aggressive, they're pinching individuals. That's possible. Or if I look at the bigger context and get a more sort of thorough look at the sensory aspect for them, is it that they have difficulty grading movement? And so it's either on or off. So that as they get excited and they want a certain staff, they grab them, but they can't go, hey, come talk to me. It's very on or off. So that can also be perceived and cause issues in terms of how they interact with staff, with their other individuals with residents in the resident or group home, or with their family members. The visual, auditory, olfactory, gustatory, I'm just going to touch over it briefly. Anyways, it talks about how anxiety affects vision, because you have your central vision, right, and your peripheral vision. Anybody sits in the car or the train and the other train starts to move, you're sitting still, or the other car at the light starts to move, and you're looking ahead, and you feel like you're moving. So that's your peripheral vision kicking off that vestibular feeling. That's showing how the two systems are wired together. Your central vision is, where you get the detail. That's sometimes very overwhelming for individuals on the autism spectrum. So I have a little bit of a bone with, a very structured IBI approach for all individuals where eye contact is demanded all the time. You like that, eh? Maybe that's an appropriate goal, but maybe that's not the first one. I worked with a little girl in kindergarten who the EA said, oh, she does her drive-by stuff. So she'd walk by the little activity table, kind of do this, manipulate a bit, and then go away. And then she'd do that a few times, and then she'd sort of gradually move in and start to do something. Using your peripheral vision could be less intense, easier to focus on what you need to do and help to screen out some of the other overwhelming stuff. Donna Williams, a woman on the autism spectrum, talks about how if people said, look at me, then she couldn't hear what they said. If she wanted to hear, she had to avert her eyes. So we need to be aware of what the demands that we're placing on the individuals, that they're at the point where they're able to meet those demands or meet them with support. The auditory system, again, it's often many people on the autism spectrum have challenges with auditory. It can be very easily overwhelming. The only way to close it out is this. Earplugs can work, but you can still hear things, right? You can also hear the noise they make inside your ear. For some people, that's intolerable. For some people, they can't tolerate the pressure against their ears, the feeling of the earplugs. If anybody wears earplugs to bed sometimes, then you put your head on your pillow and the movement of your hair, your ear on the pillow is really loud. So it's very difficult to block that out. And how many people know individuals on the autism spectrum that are either doing this all the time or some of the time, or hands over their ears with loud noises, or in anticipation of loud noise, because you never know when it's going to come, then they end up like this all the time. It's really hard to get actively involved in your day if you have your hands over your ears the whole time. The olfactory system, sense of smell. The really important part about that is that it is very important from birth. It goes straight. It's not modulated by other senses along the way. And it's very strong with memory and can be associated with trauma. When I was doing one of these talks a few years ago, it wasn't a trauma issue, but a woman came up to me afterwards and talked about how when she was pregnant with her first child, she was preparing Thanksgiving dinner, and she had contractions all through the day. Eventually, she never told me if they actually got dinner or not. I'm not sure about that part. But when you're cooking turkey, it's a very pervasive smell through the house. And she said years later that she could go into somebody's house, and if she all of a sudden had that full waft of turkey smell, she would get a contraction. That's hard wiring. The saying Norman Deutsch says, neurons that fire together wire together. So the olfactory, the smell can be key. Another individual who was about 19, male, nonverbal, autistic, who had lots of sensory-seeking behaviors. He loved pressure. He could be very intense. There was certainly aggressive issues with the family. They had some major behavior challenges. They needed to restrain him. He was a big boy. He was having this pattern of coming home and immediately aggressing at a family member, and then they would get him down into prone floor restraint. And it seemed that he might then sort of get up and then aggress again and get down again. So myself and the behavior therapist tried looking at, and I realize I'm stepping away from the smell. I will get back to that. We tried setting up a schedule so that as soon as he got home from school, we had the visuals, got him down on the floor. I took a therapy ball. I rolled it across his back and up and down his legs. It was a great core exercise for me for about 5 minutes, and then got him up, engaged in his snack and task, and then plugged it in again about another half an hour, 3/4 an hour later. And by putting in this routine, we were able to bump out the aggression out of his after-school routine. So that was helpful. The reason why I brought him up was the sense of smell. So he was a strong sensory seeker in some ways. The sense of smell, his mother said, I swear when I'm on my period, he gets aggressive. And he's always coming up and smelling at me. So I was thinking along those same lines as sensory seeking. So I went to see him in the school, and I bring my little smelling jars, and I'm trying with a few either very powerful smells and then some sort of lavender and nice gentle things. So I didn't get through too many. He was taking these little sniffs. Not exactly what I would have expected. I did the second presentation of one of the very tiny vial, I think it was like cider vinegar or something. And as soon as he took a tiny sniff, he instantly started to gag. So to me, then it's like, oh, he's not seeking, he's over-responding to the sensory, to the smell input, even though he was under-registering some of the other and needed really heavy proprioceptive. That smell he was so sensitive to, he could pick up that difference in his mother, and it really agitated him for whatever reason. So smell is very important, and that trauma piece can be really, again, something to keep in mind, particularly if you have individuals that you work with that grew up in an institution. Anybody work with older adults that had an institutional background? A few. Those were big places. I'm sure they were great in many ways, but I'm sure there were also very challenging times at things. And so, you know, the smell of a certain bathroom, the smell of a certain soap, that kind of thing might be hardwired for an individual, and maybe that's why hygiene time is always a highly agitated and aroused time for an individual, and maybe it's not because they have actually tactile sensitivity. So it's keeping that idea in mind. Sense of taste, of course, it's all very individual. But again, we have to do this at least 3 times a day. If you are hyper responsive to taste or texture, you can't get away from that. It's a nutritional need, and it's one that with children makes adults very agitated if you don't eat. So who knows people on, again, more often on the autism spectrum who have really restricted diets? A few. It's really common. It's common in my experience. You know, I'm sure there are others that have a wider range. But again, trying to, you know, sort of acknowledge the challenges and the preferences while slowly trying to widen somebody's sphere, increase their exposure in a sort of a non-demanding way may help them get past that. Okay, so sensory input comes in, it's processed in the nervous system, it's organized, interpreted, sometimes it's stored, sometimes it's related to previous experience. This is all happening unconsciously. It's like, oh yeah, I remember that when I felt that, then I needed to do this. You get the response generated. That's sort of how the loop works, but there can be many breakdowns, for lack of a better word, anywhere in that loop. And it's not a linear process. So for modulation and sensory integration, as I said, it happens automatically. It should for us to function, and for most of us, it does throughout the day. We're not having to pay a lot of attention to it. But for many of the individuals we work with in developmental disabilities and also a lot on the autism spectrum, this is disrupted, it's distorted, it takes a lot of their thought and energy because it's not a smooth process. Okay, so this is just a way of sort of looking at how sort of sensory input goes throughout the day, right? You have your optimum band of functioning when it's really just the right balance of alerting and tuning out. So right now, you need to be tuning out maybe the hum of the camera. I'm hearing a fan, oh, that fan up there. I'm having to tune out this light that every time I look up, it's blinding me in the eyes. It's a little warm in this room, or at least it feels it to me. You've just had lunch. So maybe it's taking more effort to tune in and stay alerted than it is to tune out things at this moment in time. But when you're in that good balanced state, you can have a calm and alert, you appear content, you can focus on the task and ignore the distractions. When you get outside of this band and over alerted, you see stress, agitation, overexcited, meltdowns, very distracted, not able to focus, may withdraw or shut down. So if you look at this individual here, that could get misinterpreted as looking relaxed because they're not doing anything, when in fact they're so overwhelmed they can't process anything. The opposite, when it's not enough, when you're tuned out, can appear you're lethargic. So, when you get up on a day off, Some people like to get out and go for a run right away. Some people, you know, the idea of that is like, oh my God, please don't even, you know, make me think of that. They want to sort of chill out for a bit. They need to wake up. Don't talk to me yet until I've had my coffee. That kind of individual may be a little bit more in the not quite enough, but they're not ready for stimulus. You can also, if you're not getting enough stimulus, be irritable, agitated, also distracted and hyperactive looking, which can look like this. So this can look like this or that because there's not enough getting in, so they're seeking it out. And they're moving and handling, but they're not actually doing anything functional with it. And it's also very hard to engage somebody when they're that low. And of course, this is a spectrum, right? This is the norm. We all fit on it somewhere. I had my son, I always use my children, that had many of the sort of sensory sensitivity things, but also some of the tuned out. So for the speech, he had a very low voice, really low. And so when he would get on the phone, when he would go to answer the phone, I'd catch his eye and I'm doing this wild gesture, going, and then all of a sudden he would actually have a little bit of voice to say, hello? He didn't really carry it on that well, but because he was just, his natural state was fairly low. Whereas other things brought him out here. So his just right balance was a little narrower. So when you look at the next one, some people who are really oversensitive, their band of functioning is pretty narrow. And it takes very little of things that happen. You know, if you think of this throughout your day, you start off the day here and, you know, you get up and you go for a shower and, ooh, the water on my face really bothered me. And okay, now I've, you know, had my breakfast and I feel a little bit better. And oh, now I have to, you know, go to work and I have to hit the traffic and that's going to drive me crazy. Or for an individual in a group home, somebody chose my clothes and I didn't get a choice and it's really irritating me and now I'm up here. And it's very difficult. These things add on throughout the day. And if you're narrow, your range of just right functioning is so narrow, it's very difficult to get back into that. And then you're in that state of sort of over-arousal throughout the day. Okay, this is just a different way of processing it. This is from Winnie Dunn, is an OT, occupational therapist, who came up sort of with a different theory or way of looking at sensory processing. It's basically saying the same thing, but she looks at it more from a quadrant perspective, and that you have sort of a threshold. So you think if you have a low threshold at your door, and there's flooding outside, anybody in flooding areas, low threshold, all the water's going to pour in, right? A low threshold means everything is pouring in. So you're much more easily overwhelmed. If you have a high threshold, you know, either a really big step to get in the front door, the water's not going to flow in easily if you're in a flooded area, but you may not get enough input in. You may need to really bump it up for that input to get over the threshold where you actually see it or hear it or taste it or touch it. Kids with ADHD that I've worked with in the schools, you can get a mixed picture. So, you know, parents who would be, you know, the kids playing their video game and parents in the kitchen going, okay, Johnny, you know, put that away. It's time for dinner. And she's over here, auditory directed over here. And then she ups it, her auditory a little bit more, turns this way to yell to the other room. He's still playing the video game. And then she gets over to him and, I told you to put that away. Well, for him, maybe his threshold's pretty high, and the first input he gets is in his face, I told you to put that away. And meanwhile, mom is agitated now. So is it active tuning out? Sure, maybe that does happen sometimes, but it also may be it's just not registering. Then the other thing is looking at what do you do with how your nervous system is. So this is either you're passive and you kind of go with the way your nervous system is, or on this side, it's looking at whether you actively do something to counteract what your nervous system is. But they can look the same. So somebody who has a high, 5 minutes, oh my goodness.
You could go more in 5 minutes.
Okay, 10 minutes maybe. Anyways, it goes to show that you can see somebody who, as I said before, who is overwhelmed, who is taking in too much information and sitting in a corner and barely rocking by themselves, may look the same as somebody who has a high threshold and they're not getting enough in and they're sitting in a corner rocking by themselves. So it can look the same, and that's where you need to be, why I will always default to providing sort of proprioceptive, calming, and organizing input. Because if you think somebody's understimulated and you go in there and they're actually overwhelmed, you're going to be compounding it. Okay, I'm going to skip through these a little bit. This is just to describe much of what I've said. This is what sort of OTs are looking at in terms of how we describe sensory processing disorders. Well, it didn't actually make it into the DSM-5, so it's still a dysfunction. But sensory modulation is whether you're over-responsive, you're under-responsive, or sensory seeking and craving all the time. So this impacts your ability to self-regulate. It has a big impact. Other ways to look at are sensory discrimination disorder. So people who may have difficulties with perceptual skills, fine motor skills, difficulty with poor body awareness in space. It makes it hard to do tasks. And you may get frustrated and agitated from that. But it's not because you're over-responsive, it's because you're frustrated because your body won't do what you are trying to help it or make it do. And then sensory-based motor disorder, where you have, postural disorders, low tone, dyspraxia, people who just cannot pull it together to actually follow through on their motor plans. But this is where you'll see, not all the behaviors, but this is what I'm looking at a lot, because coming to our dual diagnosis team, when there's self-injury, aggression, those kinds of things, I'm often looking to see if it's a sensory modulation disorder. So, just in the typical population, recent look at 5.3% met criteria out of 702 kindergarten children, just within the average population. 16% sensory over-responsiveness showed tactile and auditory sensory over-responsiveness in 925 children in the 7 to 11 year range. So that was another study. So within the average population, sort of, 10 to 15, 5 to 15%. And just in talking to my colleagues, there's lots of things that come up. Every time I go to make my hazelnut coffee in the kitchen, I have to close the door because my coworker beside me is overly sensitive to something in the fake hazelnut in the coffee. So I've actually stopped buying it because I'm supposed to be aware of people's sensory service systems. And she's always apologetic. No, go ahead. I'll be over here. She's really trying to fight it, but she's not making it up. So within the typical population, talk to your colleagues. Think within yourself. There's always people talk about those things that, oh no, I just can't touch that, or I can't handle that. There's a great little video, again, that I can't access, which shows a guy with Tourette's showing the things he can't stand. So he's touching a towel and he's like, ooh, and he's just like vibrating like a tuning fork. And then what he really can't tolerate is touching the toilet paper. So I sort of wanted to know, okay, what do you do if you can't touch that toilet paper? Anyway, so it's certainly sensory processing dysfunction is more common in the developmental population. Autism spectrum disorders, no surprise there. Fragile X, cerebral palsy, different genetic syndromes. Also mental health issues that can, as your internal state changes, so does your tolerance for sensory input with many individuals. Again, we can get the handouts to people for being able to sort of follow up on some of this. But certainly within the autism spectrum, from 2008 Autism Life Skills, most of them stated sensory processing challenges as the #1 difficulty for them, regardless of where they were on the spectrum. We're looking at the social stuff, absolutely. But internally on a day-to-day basis, it's not discounting the other things, but this was really big for them. But another interesting thing is individuals on the autism spectrum continuum have better visual acuity often. They talk about it having bird of prey. So, you know, you can see really good little details, but the ability to take in the whole picture is much reduced then. Plus, it can be very well overwhelming like that. The sensory part is included in the DSM-5 now, very thankfully. All OTs are very pleased with that. Because it acknowledges people aren't making this up. These are, again, just some comments that people have made. You can look at those in the handout afterwards. Fragile X, they do experience hyperarousal. It's in the biology. There are, you know, you may see that signs of overarousal, the hand flapping, the you know, whatever, biting, perceptive motor activity. And that, if you're trying to work with somebody to teach them some skills, then they're not going to be able to learn at that time. So instead of managing the behavior, you need to manage the hyperarousal in order for the behavior to be able to better manage or new strategies taught. CP, startle reflex in CP. I have a number of individuals that I work with. One guy, again, who came through our team who had a history of being sort of very sort of defensive with people and very sort of resistive of being involved with people. And when he'd get aggressive, it'd be like this. But he was slow enough that you were safe, but he would startle very easily. And this was really apparent once when we were walking into the group home that he was staying in. And he was quite relaxed talking with me, and he was actually walking quite close. And as we got to the door, somebody from the inside opened it unexpectedly. And he instantly lunged at them, lunged at me, and then he's, sorry, sorry, sorry. He hadn't intended to, and he felt terrible for doing that. But it was definitely kicked off by a startle reflex. And I tried to explain to him, not your fault. That's the way your body works. Let's see what we can do to settle you down now. Other genetic syndromes, Cornelia de Lange, we've had several that had sort of high-end elements of self-injurious behavior, Prader-Willi, the low muscle tone, high pain tolerance, and different response to temperature, tend to be very cold. We'll want to pile on stuff. Okay, I probably have to wrap it up. I'm just going to do a few more slides and then open it for questions. I can do this talk for a whole day, so it's really hard for me to bring it down to 45 minutes and then touch on the key things. So just briefly in terms of sensory assessments, these are some of the examples, the ones I'll use. Analysis of sensory behavior inventory, I think is just out there. I know some behavior therapists that use it. That looks at sort of sensory sensation avoiding and seeking. I don't tend to rely on the scores a whole bunch. I have to use a lot of sort of clinical reasoning and observation. This is just an example of easy to find screening forms that kind of help bring it up to somebody's attention. Building Bridges Through Sensory Integration was written by several OTs, and it's sort of a parent's guide for you know, looking at the sensory picture and understanding what's going on. This is an older one by Judith Reisman and Henshu, but it is specifically for individuals with developmental disabilities. It just looks at the tactile, the proprioceptive, and the vestibular. But I find this helpful as sort of adding on to maybe looking at this one. This is, I'll use with higher functioning individuals on the autism spectrum. There's also the sensory profile, which is geared for children. And this is a standardized assessment. There are more. I've just put up the ones that I'm sort of familiar with. What I will often do is if I'm working with a family, or particularly if I'm working with a family and doing a sensory assessment, and particularly if they're high enough to be able to do this, I'll also have the parents do those on themselves. So, because if you have a mismatch in the sensory systems and the sensory processing between the family members, then that makes it that much more challenging. And to be able to just help people understand that, no, they're not just trying to bug you, they're not just trying to annoy you, they're not just trying to be rigid for the sake of it. There may be an underlying reason with this. And so pointing out those differences can be helpful in terms of helping people understand where the other one's coming from. So in terms of assessment, there's not a lot of adults that are available or funded as a funded service for developmental disabilities, particularly in the adult end. So it's often just being aware of these things. Look for sensory clues. What might they be getting out of the behavior? Remember, their experience may be entirely different than what you think they're getting out of it. It may be based on past experience or their current state, because states can go up and down, right? When you're anxious, you're less able to tolerate things. When you're ill, when you're sick, when you have a tooth problem, when you have a stomach ache, when you have a headache. There are many things, think of for yourself on a day-to-day basis, where we may get a little ache, pain, tweak that kind of comes out of the blue and then it's gone the next day or a few days later. You don't really know where it came from. You didn't go to the doctor for it. It wasn't that big a deal. If you were nonverbal and couldn't explain that, how would you get that message across? How would you understand that what was happening to you, and how would you express that? Sometimes we see the self-injury, hitting ourselves, pounding on different areas. Maybe that's actually not where the discomfort is. Maybe it's referred. So always, whenever there is what seems to be a sensory aspect, I'll always want to know, have they looked at all the medical? Have they looked at all the dental? And even if those have they looked at the pharmacological, what they're taking? What are the side effects? Is it when they try a new medication, just that new medication feels different in their body, even if it hasn't got to the therapeutic effect that you're looking for? When they're so internally focused, it feels funny in me, and so I'm going to react a little different. Doesn't necessarily mean that it might work for them down the road or not, but people will react to what they feel in their body, because this they're very clued into that. With persistent, out of the blue, aggressive reactions, when somebody says, it just happened. There wasn't an antecedent. Nothing happened. Nothing that we can figure out. Then there may be a sensory defensive thing going on. And also remember that we had a really good example of this in the course that I was just on, and this would be my last point. This was pediatrics around self-regulation, and it showed a video of a parent and her son who had lots of sensory modulation issues. And she reached out to touch his head and pat him. He's going, "No, don't touch, that hurts," and everything. She goes to adjust his shirt. "Why are you pinching me? Why are you hurting me?" He was really distressed and very obvious about it. And the therapist talked about how she was showing this video to another mother and her 12-year-old daughter. And the mother said, "Oh, but that's not us. That's not Charlotte." And Charlotte says, "Yes, that is. That's me. That's what it feels like inside. But I'm keeping it in. I'm not saying it." So what's it like for that individual when they're keeping it in, and then it's the last straw, they have this massive blowout, and people are going, But you asked for that. You wanted that, cookie or yogurt. But maybe it was presented in just the wrong way for them, and that was the last straw for them. So when you get those out of the blue things, do think of sensory processing issues. And the final thing to say is, as much as OTs, we always want to sort of calm down and help people feel self-regulated. Never ever pair a really big blowout with really calming input. And I made this mistake early on in my career a few times. Till I worked with behavior therapists who helped me understand how behavior is learned and patterns are set in place. Be aware if you see some major reactions that you think are sensory, and what kind of things might be calming to the individual. Put those in the next time proactively. Don't be doing it at that point in time, because you don't want to pair those, "Oh, I know, I have a complete meltdown, pull down the ceiling fixture, and then I get my weighted blanket." Okay, I will stop there. There certainly is lots more that I could talk about, but there's other people that have equally helpful things to say.